Hello and welcome back. In this lesson, we are going to start something that I think is pretty cool and exciting. We're going to start with a brand new starter solution yet again. And this time we're going to implement a lot of added complexity into our application. We're going to implement some things like drop-down menus, modal dialogues. We're going to refactor our code, do all kinds of fun stuff to really improve our toggle that we've created and demonstrate how you could apply the toggle to some really quite complex web interaction functionality. So I think this is going to be fun. Let's go ahead and get started. First of all, just as with all of our new starter solutions, you're going to want to go ahead and go down to the video description down below, click on the link to download the starter solution. You're going to unzip that. You'll get a folder that is called Waffle Box. And once again, our example is about food. It's going to be fun and make us all very hungry. And go ahead and unzip that and change into that directory inside of the terminal, just like you see that I've done here. And the first thing we're going to do is run an npm install to install our dependencies, which include Parcel, which is the application bundler that we're using for the build process. And also, we're going to go ahead and run code space dot to open this solution up in Visual Studio Code so that we can have a look. And we'll also run an npm run start to launch this in our default browser, as you can see here. And I'm going to open up the dev tools so we can use that as well. And you can just take a quick look at the starter solution that we have. So this is an app, or you could even consider this a website, some sort of web application that's called Waffle Box. We deliver waffles to your door every day so that you don't have to leave the house ever, which is pretty exciting. And the difference with this application is that we're kind of building a website or a web app, if you will, and it's actually responsive. So you'll see here as we go down to smaller screen sizes, everything sort of adapts to be a single column. But the idea is it's going to be kind of a landing page or a splash page for this service where people will be able to do things like choose a plan, they'll have navigation, and it should be pretty representative of what you would normally expect to see in a typical web application. So feel free to scroll up and down, take a look at that. Nothing is functional when you first start it. So when you click on the buttons and stuff, they don't really do anything. It's just all kind of a blank slate to get us started. And what we're going to do is we're going to wire up some of these things where you see these little triangles where we have some menus and some drop-down buttons, if you will. First thing we're going to do is wire these up to use our toggle script that we built in the previous lessons, use the exact same script we had before, and start to understand how you would want to configure and set up additional functionality for a drop-down menu. And before we jump into doing that, let's go into Visual Studio Code. Let's take a look at our source folder, and let's take a look at the files that we're going to be working with in this new starter solution. So even though it's very similar to what we've done before, there are some differences this time around. Just want to make sure you feel comfortable navigating. So first of all, we have our index.html, which as always is loading in a theme as well as an app.sass file. And the Sass file itself is actually broken down into quite a few different files, but app.sass you'll see is loading in some menu styles, some hero styles. The hero is what you can consider this big splash image in this little row down here. We're loading in some default drop-down styles, which are basically nothing other than just hiding some drop-downs we have behind the scenes because there is some HTML for the drop-downs already in there. So that's a pretty basic starting point there. A little bit of styles for the columns, some other aesthetic stuff for like the FAQs and the benefits. All this stuff you can feel free to dig into, but the main one that we're going to be concerned with is going to be the dropdowns.sass file. That's the one where we're going to build out some styles for our dropdowns, which if you just use your inspector here, you can sort of see if I disable that style, there's like some extra HTML in here for these dropdowns, but we haven't done anything with them yet. It's not wired up. It's just purely HTML so that whenever we start adding that stuff, you guys don't have to spend time typing all that HTML in. It's already kind of in there by default. Scrolling down in the index.html file, we have our nav bar as always. Here is the HTML for our menu, which includes our drop-down HTML. So it's just basically an unordered list with some hierarchy to it. So there's child unordered lists with list items. And it's just a typical what you would expect to see from a navigation menu. That's a very typical HTML structure from a navigation menu. And if we scroll down further into the page area, here is what we are calling the hero, or that big image sort of splash area. So there's our content for that. We have our choose a plan row, which is right here. So we have choose a plan and subscribe, which we're going to wire up shortly later. And then finally, if you scroll all the way down, you have our main column, which has benefits, and way down at the bottom, it has a sidebar with the FAQ. So that's just this content down here. Really, that's just there to kind of be filler content and to give this app a little bit of a realistic feel, if you will. So and then finally at the bottom, we are loading an app.js, which has our default toggle configuration in it. And of course, toggle.js, it's loading that, which is the same thing where we left off at the end of the last lesson. So no changes here whatsoever. It's literally just copied and pasted from the last lesson. You can feel free to bring over any customizations you did in the last lesson and paste that into here as well if you feel so inclined. And that's it. That is our starter solution. So let's get started with trying to wire up. First of all, let's wire up this choose a plan button. I think this is going to be the easiest one to do. It's pretty similar to all the other toggles that we've done before. If you take a look at the HTML for that section, you can see here it is. So we have a div with a class of dropdown. We have a toggle button. So the toggle button itself is going to toggle this UL, or unordered list, with an ID of plans, and that actually contains the drop-down content. And so we've already added some classes to this. We have that container with a class of drop-down. We have the unordered list itself has a class of drop-down -menu. And basically what we need to do in order to wire this up is give our button a data attribute that's going to point to the target, the toggle target. So that's pretty easy to do. We can make up our own attribute. So I'll just call this data-dropdown equals. And then of course, just like in all of our other toggles, we're going to put the selector for the toggle target into the attribute value for data-dropdown. So in this case, it'll be #sign plans, which will do a query selector for the ID element with an ID of plans, which of course will point to this down here. And now that we've added that attribute, we'll need to go into our app.js, and rather than configuring default toggles, let's take that out and just do dropdowns, const dropdowns equals new toggle, and then we'll have to do a attr of data-dropdown, because that's what we call that attribute. And also toggle container is not .toggle, which is the default value. But again, if you remember here, we surrounded it in a container called with a class of just dropdown. So we'll say toggle container is .dropdown, like so. And just by doing that, you'll notice nothing visual. But now if we go and we inspect the HTML down here, you'll notice here is our unordered list. If we click on the button, it's going to add active, and it's going to toggle the ARIA expanded attribute on the button. So that is all wired up, just like all of our other toggles. And we should probably give our button a default ARIA expanded equals false. So it's not expanded by default. And that'll just give it a default value when the page first loads, which is good to do. And now we just need to make sure our dropdown is not display none. We want to change its display to be tied to the active class, which is being toggled on this dropdown menu. So that is a CSS change. We're just going to move this display none into a not active declaration here. So we're going to say when you have a drop-down menu that is not active, then let's display none. And then that way, you'll see here, if we refresh to kind of get a blank slate, now the menu, the drop-down menu itself will display whenever it has that active class. And that is working pretty good. That's kind of a basic drop-down menu. It's a very simple toggle. But normally with a drop-down menu, just presentation-wise, you would kind of not expect it to push the content down here below. So you could also do something like position absolute, and then you'll see just by adding that position absolute. It is overlaying the content down below. And of course, you would want to give that some sort of background color as well, so it's more visible than what you see here. So let's add that. So we'll add background is maybe dark. That looks good. And let's add a radius to it. Border radius will be top left will be 0, top right will be 0. And then we have a config variable for radius that we use for things like these. You notice the rounded edges on the buttons. We'll just set the bottom left and the bottom right border radius to that. So you see that just rounds off the bottom of the menu a little bit. And that's starting to look a little better. I think it's generally a good idea to add some padding to a drop-down menu, top and bottom padding. So we could do like 15 and 20 pixels respectively. So that'll just kind of give it a little spacing on the top and the bottom. And it's also usually a good idea to set a width. So maybe like 200 pixels or something. And that looks good. And this actually looks like it's center aligned for some reason. So let me look at the computed styles and see where that's coming from. Text align center is coming from hero.sass on the plan style. So let's go to hero.plan right here. Let's just take that off. I don't think we need that. There we go. That looks better. So I just took off the text align center from this hero.sass file there. And now we have a left aligned drop down menu that is looking pretty good. It's also a good idea to kind of set the position, even though in this case the position is actually showing up where we want it. It's usually a good idea to set the positioning on a drop-down menu to make sure that, for example, we want the top to be 100%, so it'll always appear exactly at the bottom of the containing drop-down menu. But that's going to obviously put it way down here, so we want to make sure that also the drop-down container is position relative. And then that way, wherever you put your drop-down container, which is this outer container right here, the drop-down menu is always going to be exactly 100% or exactly at the bottom of that outer container, which is going to give us a little more control over the positioning of the drop-down menu, which is good. And we should also set the left to 0 to make sure it's always positioned at the left edge of that outer container. And because we fixed the width of this menu at 200 pixels, I generally think it's a good idea to add some sizing options. So for example, you could do like .sm width 150 pixels. And that just means if you add an additional sort of utility class of SM. So if we were to add drop-down menu SM, you'll see it shrinks it down to a smaller size. And I also generally think it kind of looks weird when you have a wide drop-down button like you see here, but your drop-down menu itself is smaller than the button. I think that just looks weird, so I generally also add a min width to this. So we could do min width 100%. And then that way, it's just always going to be at least as wide as its drop-down button, the trigger button itself. And I think that looks a little bit nicer for sure. And you could also do like a large size down here, like LG width is 250 pixels. So for whatever reason, if we wanted this to be a large drop down, you can see there it gives you a little bit more room. And then that way through the HTML, you just have a lot of control over the sizing of your drop down menus. And I think that looked good with a small one so that it's exactly the width of the drop down button in this case. And just in case we get into any layering issues, it's definitely a good idea on your drop downs to set a Z index. So we could just set something like 10, like it doesn't really matter, like you could mess with it. It depends on your particular application, but it's a good idea just to do that in case you have something that might appear over top of your drop down menu. You want to make sure it's always going to appear on top, and that's looking pretty good at this point. To give it a little more contrast with content behind it, especially if you have a lighter style background or something, like we have a dark background in this case, but it's generally also going to be a good idea to set a box shadow on these elements to make it appear as if it pops out from the page a little bit more. So we could do something like, I usually do kind of a big shadow, like 12 pixels, 15 pixels. So it's going to move 12 on the y-axis, so it's going to move down and it's going to blur by 15 pixels. And then we could just take our background color, like transparentize. We can even do darkest. Or no, I think there's a variable called black. I forget. Let's look in config.sass. darkest. So it's the darkest variable, and we'll do that by 0.5 or something. And you'll just see it just adds a shadow around that, probably like 0.7. That looks a little bit better. So it's kind of subtle there, but you'll notice if I turn it on and off over here with this checkbox, you'll just notice the shadow that appears, gives it a little more contrast with the content behind, which I think is important when you have a drop-down menu. And finally, the last thing I do presentation-wise with a drop-down menu, especially if you have like, if this were a large menu, like so, the problem you're going to run into is if this button were over on the right side here, you would have issues with this menu being, well, I can just show you actually. If we were to move the plan to be justify content flex end, and then we were to remove the subscribe button. So let's just take subscribe and delete that. You'll see how it's running off the edge of the screen here. So what we want is in our style sheet is we want to optionally be able to override the default left alignment of this drop-down menu. So in these scenarios, we can kind of have a right aligned menu, and that's pretty easy to do. Again, just like our size utility class, we can add a utility class for alignment. And we could just say, you know, for example, if it has a class of align right, let's override the left style right here. So we can say left auto, but then right will be 0. So we're going to align it to the right edge of that. And now that that has been added, we can come up here and again, if this were justify content flex end, but now if our drop-down menu has align right, you'll see it's going to align itself to the right side of the drop-down menu, which again just gives us a little more control over the display of that, which I think works out really well. But let me go back to the default here, which is just small, but we've added those utility classes. I think this is going to work really well in most cases for our drop-downs, and all we had to do was add a bit of CSS, and we're using our same toggle script as before, and we are already pretty close with our drop-downs. This is working pretty well, mostly just a CSS thing in terms of the implementation of the drop-down itself. However, with a drop-down, there are a couple really important considerations to make in terms of adding some usability and some what you would normally expect to be able to do with that drop-down. And this is why I save drop-downs until this far into the series, because even though drop-downs are deceptively simple, there's actually a lot that you need to do with them to make them really good. And it's a kind of a pet peeve of mine when I'm using any app and developers don't spend the time to add the features to a drop-down that they really should. I just think it's so important to spend a little bit of time and make your application behave as if it were a drop-down in any other operating system or web app or whatever, and just give users as much functionality as they would normally come to expect from a drop-down. I think it's so frustrating when people don't do that. And just as an example, let's just say that I'm using a drop-down in the OS, in the operating system. And if I were to right-click somewhere, it opens up like sort of a drop-down menu or a context menu, whatever you want to call it. And if I were to click away from that, it dismisses that menu. And that could be an interaction that you could call a blur. We are blurring away or sort of dismissing that menu that we brought up through what you could call a click away. We're clicking away, and we're sort of indicating to the operating system that, hey, you know what? I didn't want that drop-down menu. And that's pretty standard with drop-down menu functionality. Like if I click up here and then I click somewhere else, I dismiss or I blur that menu that I was just looking at. And that's very, very ubiquitous in all software. And if you are writing a website or a web app and you implement a dropdown, and if the user clicks away, currently that dropdown stays active. I now have to go back to it. If I want to collapse it, I have to go back to it and actually click on the trigger button to dismiss that menu. And that can be frustrating. And again, that's why it's kind of a pet peeve of mine, is that I don't think this is the right way to implement a dropdown. And that means that with our toggle script that we've created, we need to add some new functionality to it, some blur sort of functionality to it in order to allow users to be able to dismiss on click away. And in order to do that, what we're going to do is go into our toggle.js script. And first of all, we're going to add a new option down here called blur, which will be false by default. And we definitely don't want this to be a default option, because if you remember from our previous lessons, we've implemented this toggle into things like tabs and accordions and simple toggles where you can toggle the display of an element on and off. And in a lot of cases, you may not want to have blur on click away. Like obviously with a tab, if I click away from a tab, I don't expect it to be collapsed. And sort of the same thing with an accordion. But in some cases, like in the case of a dropdown, I certainly do want the ability to blur or to dismiss on click away. And that's why we're going to have this be false by default. But when we instantiate our dropdown configuration, we're going to set blur to true to make sure that we implement it in this case. And whenever we have blur enabled, basically what we want to do is we want to say, okay, if you click on the button or anything inside of the dropdown, then that's okay, right? We don't want to do anything in those cases. So if you're within the dropdown itself, then just continue as you normally would. You can click on all the links, you can click on the drop-down menu, you can click on the button, and we're not going to do anything with that. But if you click outside of that, then that's where we want to say, hey, go to any open toggles or active toggles and let's dismiss those because we clicked outside of a dropdown in this case. And because our current click listener is basically that first line of the click listener, if we go to our toggle method down here, it's basically saying not a toggle button. We are dismissing anything that's not inside of a toggle button. It's not going to be a good candidate to actually use this listener to do this functionality. We could do something like this big if-then statement, if-else statement, where we say if you clicked on a toggle button, then do this code, or if you clicked anywhere else in the document, then do this. But I think that gets into like messy territory. It's going to get really messy really quickly because then we're shoving all of our blur functionality and our toggle stuff into this one click listener. What I actually think is a better pattern in most cases is when you have a blur, let's add a whole separate click listener for that. And it can have its own sort of method that just focuses on what a blur is. So what we'll do is we'll change this to be add listeners, and we'll actually have multiple listeners. So we're going to add document.add event listener, click, and just like we did up above where we're listening to all clicks on the document, we're just going to pass this listener to a separate method we're going to create, doesn't exist yet, and we can just call it blur. So we'll pass our mouse event to this custom blur method that we're going to create on this class, and that method is going to check to see those conditions that we just mentioned. Did you click outside of a dropdown? And if that's the case, we'll go to all the active dropdowns and we will dismiss them. So let's create that listener now. That's going to be this.blur. It's basically going to be the same sort of thing as this. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the top part of our toggle listener right here, and we'll go down after our toggle, and we will change this to blur. No, not brr, but blur. And then let's change the comment up here to be blur on click away. And we're capturing a mouse event as E, so that's the event itself. The first thing here we want to do is we actually want to check to see if blur is enabled, first of all. Because if you haven't enabled blur, then we just don't care, right? We can return immediately. So we'll say blur not enabled. If this.config.blur is falsy, then simply return right away. So that's going to, in the case of like tabs and accordions, we don't do anything. That's going to be good performance. With the listener immediately returns. It doesn't try to check anything before that. That's going to work really well. But in the case that you do have blur enabled, then let's do some blur stuff down here. And I actually don't need this this not a toggle button thing. We'll just delete that for now because we're going to do something different here. And what we're going to do is, again, what I mentioned is the logic needs to be when you click away. So in this case, we're click away. We need to go and get all the active buttons, and we need to check, first of all, was that click inside of the dropdown? Because in that case, we don't want to dismiss it. Because if I click right here, I don't want that to dismiss our dropdown. I want that click to continue as normal. Or if I click right here, I don't want that to run a dismiss or a blur. I want that to continue to work as normal. We don't want to prevent any of those actions. But if our click was over here, and if that click wasn't inside of this dropdown, and this dropdown is currently active, let's go ahead and dismiss that dropdown. So what we'll have to do is we'll basically have to say, let's go get all the active dropdowns. And we kind of did that before when we did this collapse siblings within single container thing. So we're kind of doing this query selector all thing right here. So I can actually just copy this. But instead of selecting them within single container, we can just simply say document.querySelectorAll. So we're going to go get all the data-dropdowns in this case, but we're going to further filter them by aria expanded equals true. And then we're going to say for each active button, let's do something here. So we'll say blur active toggle buttons. And what I want to do is check and see if this button, which is currently active, is if the click or e.target, so the click target from this blur listener, is inside of this button's toggle container, right? Because I want to be able to allow clicks not just on the button, but also within the toggle container itself, which in this case is the whole dropdown. So this .dropdown thing. So what we'll do is we'll say get toggle container. And so we'll say const active container equals active button dot closest this dot config dot toggle container, like so. So that's going to get the container for this active button that we found on this click. And then we'll basically say blur if the click target isn't inside the container. So we can say if active container dot contains e dot target. Right? So what, and I'm doing a falsy check here. So I'm saying basically this dot contains is going to tell us whether or not this HTML element up here contains this HTML element. And that's kind of, I think that's something that we haven't used before. That's another sort of a pseudo traversal method. But it's a very, very handy thing that you can use to basically say, did you click inside of this in this case? And in this case, I'm saying, if you didn't click inside of it, that's why we put the exclamation point there. Then let's go ahead and run active button.click. And that's all there is to it to create a blur. So hopefully if I did this right, now that blur is enabled on these dropdowns, I can click on this, I can click inside of the dropdown menu and everything's going to be great. But if I click away, it's going to dismiss that. And that's exactly what we want, right? We want to be able to click on the button, do all the normal stuff, click away, and it dismisses our dropdown. Just like that, we added the blur functionality, we added some styles to our dropdown, and we implemented some really, I think, what is really required functionality for your dropdowns. And all it took was just adding a little bit of a separate listener, checking to see if our click target is inside of that button's container, and from there, just deactivating the button itself. And just a note here, you'll notice I did not do e.prevent default in this case because you don't actually want to prevent a blur click. So for example, if I'm blurring, but I'm clicking up here on the subscribe button, I still want to be able to do whatever I'm doing on subscribe, right? When I click on that, I want to go to its destination or whatever. And so you don't want to prevent that. And you can basically just leave out that e.prevent default because you'll see here when I click on subscribe, it's going to dismiss the menu, but it's also going to continue to do whatever I clicked on up here. And that's important on a blur click because otherwise, if you did e.prevent default, you would click once and it would dismiss the menu, and then you'd have to click again to actually go to the subscribe URL or whatever that button does. And that's not what you want. You want your blurs to not actually prevent the default, but they're just kind of augmenting what already happens on that click by dismissing active menus. So there's probably a couple other things we could do to further improve this drop-down menu. First of all, you guys know I like CSS and entry animations. So the first thing I would probably do is create an effect, sort of a drop-in, which we did previously, very, very similar to that. So what we could do is in our app.sas file, let's go ahead and right-click over here. We'll create a new effects.sas, and then we'll create a keyframes for drop-in. So that'll be a drop-in animation that's going to go from 0% opacity 0, transform, translate Y, negative, I don't know, 15 pixels, 20 pixels, something like that. And then at 100%, we'll do opacity 1, transform, translate Y, 0. So that's going to be our animation. We'll create a little utility class for that, .drop in, animation, drop in, 0.3 seconds, ease. So now that we've created this effects.sas file, let's make sure it is loaded inside of our app.sas. So import effects, like so. And now we can simply, in our HTML, on the drop-down menu, we'll add drop dash in. And then you'll see here, we get a nice little entry animation on that drop-down menu, which I think works pretty good. Another thing we could do is we could probably just add a little rotate animation to the triangle over here. And you'll notice if we inspect this, that actually has a class I've already set up on it. So it has a span with a class of try. And that's pretty easy to manipulate in our SAS file here. We could add the bottom of drop downs, we'll add triangle, and we'll do .try. But when you have aria expanded equals true, and then you have a triangle inside of that, and let's do a transform rotate 90 degrees. So we're going to rotate to the right 90 degrees, which you'll see will flip it downward. So it's sort of directing users to look down at the menu here, which I think is a good pattern. And we'll want to set a transition on the transform of 0.3 seconds ease as well. So it'll be the same timing as the drop-in animation. And now you'll see we got a nice little animation on that arrow, which is going to help users sort of focus on this drop-down content down here. And it's going to, of course, blur away and rotate back up to the right anytime the menu is not active. All right, I think this is working pretty well at this point. We have our blur and we have our basic styles and our animations and transitions implemented for our drop-down menus. So in the next lesson, we're going to continue to expand our drop-down, make it a really great interaction component, and add it to some other areas of our application like our navigation menu and see how we can improve that even further.